Hello and welcome to the Coffee Talk. With me today is not Henrike, but rather we have an amazing guest, Sana Zafar. I hope I didn't butcher your last name too badly. She's a awesome. She's a postdoctoral associate at the University of Florida with an extensive background in HR. And I invited you today to speak about your research, which I think is super interesting, on the kind of link between pay inequity and the consequences for employers. So I know there are like survey evidence of that, pay inequity makes our employees less productive, more likely to leave. But I think this is it the first study that actually shows this academically? Tell me about it.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me here, Margaret. It's an honor to talk about this research, and my co-authors and I are very passionate about this paper just because it's a very important topic. So, as you mentioned, there is not a lot of research on the outcomes of a gender pay gap, which is surprising, but it's also because it's very difficult to kind of measure it. The data is not easily available, and so that might explain some of the lack of research on the topic. We are fortunate to have a data set that uses sub-agencies from the United States federal government or Office of Personnel Management. And so we have a total of 125 sub-agencies that we have data for over a period of 9 years. And in that, we are able to connect the pay data, which includes the names of employees, their job titles or their job classification, their age, there's their the education. So all of those things, and we're able to calculate a difference within each sub-agency after accounting for all these different factors that could affect pay. We're able to see the difference in pay of men and women within the same organization. So once we do that, we see that on average, there is a 5% discrepancy or disparity in how much women are paid and men are paid within the same organization. And then we have another data set that captures the organizational climate. It's an organizational climate survey, so it captures responses to like how satisfied are employees with their organizations. And so we take the data on pay and we link it to these outcomes to see how the pay difference within a sub-agency affects the satisfaction of men and women. And because men and women are affected differently by a gender pay gap, we expect there to be different results.
And what do you find? So I think intuitively we would expect women to become very unhappy, right? So we are talking about, you measured on average across these subdivisions, a 5%, what we call in kind of the comp world, a 5% equal pay gap, right? Which is huge. So, but I would expect, having been exposed myself to an equal pay gap, that would make women really unhappy. But what you find is a little bit more nuanced, right?
That's true. And like you said, and I've also kind of seen it in HR as well, you would expect women to be unhappy and maybe not expect men to be that affected by it. Surprisingly, what we find is that men as well as women within the organization are less happy or less satisfied with their organization as the gender pay gap within an organization increases. So then we dig deeper into what could be the mechanism that would explain this. And we find that the mechanisms for why a gender pay gap, an unexplained gender pay gap, affects satisfaction of men and women, why it differs, we try to look at the mechanism for that. And so what we find is that for women, they are directly affected by a gender pay gap. And So an unexplained gender pay gap directly reduces their satisfaction with their organization. For men, it's kind of different. Yes, they're directly affected by it, but they're also kind of indirectly affected by it. And I'll explain that a little bit. So for women, I think, like you said, we kind of expect a gender pay gap, or we kind of know that within society there are structural factors that could influence how much women and men are paid. I think men are less aware of such challenges that exist, and so when they find out that there's a gender pay gap within their organization, they're more likely to link it to their organization's acceptance or tolerance of practices that shouldn't be tolerated, like discrimination against, or just bias for one group. And so that's what we find. We find that for women, there's no such linkage. They don't, in simpler terms, like blame their organization for the presence of a gender pay gap in their organization, but it does affect their satisfaction with the organization. Men see it as their organization's acceptance or tolerance of prohibited practices, which ultimately then affects their satisfaction with their organization.
So men are also unhappy.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, awesome. Interesting. So then what are the so I think this is such an important study because it's done in a very rigorous manner. I'm being a little bit biased, being a little bit involved, but because I think
just a little bit.
but I think showing this in an academic and rigorous manner, I think is new. So how do we translate that into some takeaways from our audience, our HR managers and comp leaders? What is the bottom line for them from this study?
I think, like you mentioned, one of the things is that we maybe don't expect men to be affected. And so one of the interesting findings of this study is that it's not just women, but also men who are affected by gender pay gaps. Their satisfaction with their organization is affected. So improving a gender pay gap, or like working towards more equal pay within an organization, is good for not just women in the organization, but also for men in the organization. And, knowing that there are these gaps within, they're structurally embedded, I think it's important to look within your organization, like for HR in general, like just being wary of when you're hiring someone, being cautious of being fair when you allocate salaries. Like I remember having that role at one point. So you're very aware of how much experience someone brings and things of the sort, and you're aware of the benchmarks within your within each department. So just being cautious, trying to be fair, and then doing regular audits to see if, even after being careful, are there still differences within the organization? Are men and women being paid equally? And if not, then that is something that needs to be addressed so that both men and women can be happier with the organization, because we know that when employees are happy with their organization, there are benefits to that.
Awesome. Well said. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain your research on our coffee talk. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.